The mess hall at Ashcroft State went quiet the way a room does, when everyone senses something coming before they can put a name to it. Corrigan sat at the head of his table, all shaved scalp and jailhouse ink crawling up past his collar. The man who'd run D-Block for the better part of 10 years, and he watched the new arrival the way a wolf studies a stray that hasn't learned the rules yet. The new man moved slowly through the line, tall and unhurried, dark hair going silver at the temples, a faint scar tracing the left edge of his jaw, and eyes the color of cold gray water that took in every corner of the room without ever seeming to search for anything. He didn't fit. That was the trouble. He wore his prison grays like a man wearing a suit cut to measure, calm in a place where calm got you tested, and Corrigan couldn't stand the sight of it. So he stood, made a show of it for his crew, and crossed the floor with a paper cup of coffee steaming in his fist. "Fresh meat," he said, loud enough that the guards could pretend they hadn't heard, and then he tipped that scalding cup slowly over the new man's head like he was crowning him. Nobody breathed. The coffee ran down the stranger's face and soaked into his collar, and he didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't so much as tighten his jaw. He just let out one slow breath, wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and looked up at Corrigan with something that came close to pity. That was the moment Corrigan should have understood he'd made the worst mistake of his life, because the quiet man standing in front of him wasn't fresh meat at all. What Corrigan didn't know, what nobody in that mess hall knew yet, was that the stranger dripping coffee onto the concrete had once given orders that emptied whole stretches of waterfront. That half the men working the docks from Providence to Boston still spoke his name low, like a prayer they were afraid to finish. And what the guards would come to learn about him in the days ahead, about why a man who'd once owned an empire had walked into Ashcroft of his own free will and let the gate lock behind him, would overturn everything they thought they understood about power, about mercy, and about the price a man will pay to protect the one person he has left in this world. If a story about second chances and the quiet strength it takes to face down your own past is the kind of thing that moves you, do us a small favor, tap that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. It only takes a second, and it means the world to us. Now let's go back to the morning where it all began. Ashcroft State Prison stood silent on a flat stretch of land nearly 40 miles from the city, a gray concrete mass raised in the years after the war, and, through all those decades, it had learned how to swallow human beings without leaving the slightest trace behind. The walls here did not only imprison bodies, they wore down the spirit, gnawing away at hope piece by piece until what remained was nothing but the bare habit of survival. Anyone who had ever passed through those gates quickly understood one thing, that the rules printed in the guard's handbook were only the outer shell, while the real law that governed this place was written in another language, the language of the strong and the weak, of those who gave and those who had to beg. Block D was where that hidden law showed itself most clearly. It was one of the harshest cell blocks in Ashcroft, the place that held men even the other blocks did not want. And in the middle of that miniature world filled with calculation, Corrigan sat at the top like a king who had never had to defend his throne with anything except fear. He did not need to raise his voice to make people obey. All he had to do was enter the common room, and conversations would immediately sink by half a tone, eyes would hurry down to the tabletops, and the already cramped space would seem to shrink a few inches more. Corrigan understood the weight of that, and he fed it carefully, the way a man tends a fire that must never be allowed to go out. He decided who got to sit near the window and catch the rare patch of sunlight, and who had to retreat into the dark corner. He decided what goods were smuggled through Block D, who could borrow cigarettes, and who had to pay at a cutthroat price. He decided whether a newcomer would be left in peace or turned into a living lesson for the others to watch. For nearly 10 years, no one had been brave enough or foolish enough to challenge that order. Those who had ever thought of doing so had learned their lesson one way or another, and most of them now knew only to lower their heads whenever Corrigan's shadow fell across them. Even the guards understood in silence that a Block D held in Corrigan's hand was far easier to manage than a Block D in chaos. So they chose to close their eyes to what happened in the dark, as long as the surface stayed calm and the end of shift reports stayed clean. That silence was what fed his power, and Corrigan was grateful for it in the way a predator is grateful to the forest that hides him. That morning, when he sat at his usual head of the table and watched the new prisoner move through the breakfast line, Corrigan did not feel danger. He felt insulted. Because for nearly 10 years on his invisible throne, he had grown used to reading people within a few seconds, and the men who entered Block D usually fell into one of two kinds. The first kind trembled, eyes darting around for somewhere to hide, trying to make themselves as small as possible. The second kind did the opposite, puffing out their chests and pretending to be tough, throwing out a few empty challenges to cover the fear screaming inside. Corrigan could deal with both kinds in an instant. The frightened ones were broken. The ones who pretended were exposed, and one way or another, all of them eventually knelt. But the quiet man who passed through the breakfast line that morning belonged to neither kind. He did not tremble, and he did not perform. He simply existed, with a calm that made Corrigan ache, the calm of someone who had stood in places Corrigan could not even imagine, who had seen things that made all of Block D look like nothing more than a children's yard. And it was precisely that inexplicable composure, that made him rise sharply to his feet. What Corrigan did not realize in that moment was that the power he had spent nearly a decade building was far more fragile than he believed. It was not built on any solid foundation at all, but stood only because of one thing: everyone's belief that he could not be touched. Once that belief cracked, even by a line as thin as a strand of hair, the whole castle would begin to shake. All of Block D then was like a room that had been filling with gas for years, waiting for a single spark. And no one in the cafeteria that morning, not even the man sitting at the top with a cup of hot coffee in his hand, understood that the person who had just silently taken that entire cup of coffee over his head was the very spark fate had sent, to burn down a reign built from fear, and to open an empty space that no one could possibly have guessed would be filled with what came next. Only a few corridors away from the Block D cafeteria, in a cramped room not much larger than a storage closet, Delphine Marchetti set her worn leather briefcase on the table and began another work shift she already knew would not be easy. That room had never been designed as a place for therapy. They had simply emptied it out, put in 2 plastic chairs, a metal table bolted firmly to the floor, and called it a psychological counseling room, as if a name alone were enough to turn 4 cold walls into a place where human beings could open their hearts. Delphine had been doing this work at Ashcroft for nearly 2 years as a contract psychologist, which meant she was not part of the official staff, had no office of her own, had nothing but a few sessions each week and a list of names the system had all but given up on long ago. At 27, she was far younger than most inmates imagined when they heard her title, but anyone who sat across from her for only a few minutes would quickly understand that her slender appearance meant nothing at all. Her dark brown hair was always tied low and neat, her white coat had faded after countless washings, and those brown eyes of hers, eyes that always seemed to carry a deep weariness but had never once surrendered, were the eyes of someone far too accustomed to looking directly into the darkest corners of human beings without allowing herself to turn away. Every morning, when she passed through the layers of security doors and heard the electronic locks close behind her, Delphine reminded herself why she had chosen this work instead of some comfortable private practice in the city, where clients came in with ordinary anxieties and paid on time. She believed, stubbornly and almost defiantly, that even people society had labeled as lost causes still carried something inside worth saving, that behind every heavy sentence there was a story no one had ever been willing to sit down and listen to all the way through. That belief made her unusually patient, but it also wore her down in the way only people who work at healing others can understand, because every day she gave away a little more of herself, and there was not always anything given back. That morning there were 3 appointments on her schedule, and all 3 were cases her colleagues had long since shaken their heads over. One was a middle-aged man who had almost stopped speaking altogether, and only sat staring into empty space for the entire session. Another was a young man with anger, always waiting to flare up at any moment. The kind of anger Delphine understood was really only armor covering a wound that had never been named. And the last was someone she knew almost certainly would not appear, just as he had failed to appear 3 times in a row before. She still opened each file, reread her own notes, and prepared herself for each meeting with the care of someone who knew that a single question asked in the wrong place could cause the entire wall a patient had built to collapse. or worse, grow thicker. But there was one kind of file Delphine always skimmed very quickly, almost refusing to let her eyes stop on it. They were files involving charges connected to protection rackets, extortion, and illegal operations hidden behind orderly organizations. Every time she came across those lines, something in her chest tightened, a reflex so deeply rooted that she was not even conscious of it anymore, and she would quickly close the file and push it aside with some vague excuse, saying the case did not match her specialty, that it would be better for someone else to handle it. She had never explained to anyone, not even to herself, why that was so. She only knew there was an empty place in her past that she had spent nearly her whole life refusing to look at, an old wound covered over with layer after layer of work and reason, and those charges were like a careless finger touching precisely the painful place, making her pull away by instinct. Delphine had built her life almost from nothing, passing through years she rarely spoke of to anyone, and she still remembered with perfect clarity the strange feeling of receiving her college acceptance letter, along with a tuition grant whose source she had never been able to discover, money that had quietly appeared at the very moment when she had believed every door was closing, with no name attached, no message, nothing at all that would allow her to say thank you. For years she had tried to forget that question, treating it as some accidental kindness from fate, because searching for the answer would require her to turn back and look at things she had buried very deep. And so she kept living, kept working, kept stepping into this cramped room each week, with the belief that she was healing other people, never knowing that her own wound, the one that had never been touched, was about to be awakened by a person already on his way into her life, in a way she could never have expected. The morning that man was brought into Ashcroft began like every other morning in the intake area, with the screech of iron doors, the sharp smell of bleach clinging to every brick, and the pale white light pouring down from fluorescent tubes that made every face look equally drained. Salvatore Bianchi stood in the middle of the processing room, his hands hanging at his sides, waiting his turn with a patience that made the guard in charge glance at him more than once. They ordered him to remove his outer clothing, to surrender everything that belonged to the man he had once been, and he followed each step slowly and neatly, as if this were merely a dull administrative procedure he had long expected, rather than the moment when a human being was stripped of everything that had once defined him. When they read aloud his new prisoner number, that soulless string of digits that would replace the name an entire stretch of coastline had once lowered its voice to speak, he only gave a slight nod, as though confirming something obvious. There was no resistance, no panic of the kind usually seen in men hearing the door of freedom close behind them for the first time. The guard handling his intake had watched every kind of person pass through this room over the years. Men who screamed, men who wept, men who tried to act as if they feared nothing while their hands shook violently, and he had believed he could read anyone within a few minutes. But the man standing before him revealed nothing at all. His composure was not the strained composure of someone forcing himself to hide fear, but a calm that came from within, deep and steady as the surface of a lake in the early morning, the kind that made a person suddenly feel that he was the one being observed rather than the other way around. The guard wrote a few lines in the file, then looked up again, and for one strange instant he had the uneasy feeling that he ought to be more respectful, though he could not understand why. That feeling irritated him, so he quickly looked down, finished the rest of his work, and signaled for the next man to escort Bianchi away. Salvatore was led along the long, deep corridors of Block D, past cell doors where, from behind the bars, dozens of curious eyes followed each step of the newcomer, trying to measure what sort of man he was, whether he would be a threat, prey, or just another shadow passing through before being forgotten. He did not return any gaze, nor did he avoid one. He simply walked in silence, with the bearing of someone passing through a familiar place, not a strange and dangerous one. His cell was near the end of the row, and when the iron door opened and then closed behind him with a dry metallic echo, the cellmate already inside sprang up from the lower bunk like a startled animal. Ezra Pike was a thin man in his late 20s, with shoulders that always seemed slightly hunched and eyes that kept darting around, as if waiting for disaster to strike at any moment. He had been in Ashcroft long enough to learn that the safest way to survive was to become invisible, keep his head down, cause trouble for no one, and absolutely never draw the attention of men like Corrigan. When he saw his new cellmate, Ezra's first instinct was caution, because in this world, a stranger always meant a dangerous unknown. But after watching for only a few minutes, that caution slowly gave way to a curiosity he could not suppress. This man was unlike anyone he had ever encountered inside these walls. He did not hurry to mark his territory, did not throw out threats to establish his place, and did not shrink into a corner like the weak. He simply placed the thin blanket and the few small items he had been issued on the upper bunk, sat down, and looked around the cramped cell with an unreadable thoughtfulness, as though he were assessing not these four walls, but something much larger beyond them. "Are you completely new here?" Ezra blurted out, his voice small, immediately regretting that he had spoken. The man turned to look at him, and instead of the irritation Ezra had expected, there was only a calm in those gray eyes that was almost gentle. "I have been many places," he answered, his voice low and slow. "Just never this one." That brief answer explained nothing, yet somehow it made Ezra feel strangely relieved, and he sat down on the edge of his own bunk, secretly watching his new cellmate, with the eyes of someone who had just realized that the quiet man now sharing this narrow room with him might carry more secrets inside him than anything Ashcroft Prison had ever witnessed, and that somehow his own small and fearful life was about to be pulled into that man's orbit. Nightfall in Ashcroft was unlike any night beyond its walls, because here the darkness was never complete. There was always the sickly yellow glow of the corridor lights spilling through the bars, drawing broken strips of light across the cell floor, and there were always sounds that never fully faded. A dry cough echoing from somewhere, the creak of bed springs, the muttering of some man drifting through restless sleep. Ezra Pike lay on the lower bunk, eyes wide open as he stared up at the wooden board above him, where his new cellmate lay so utterly still that if Ezra had not heard his steady breathing, he would have thought the upper bunk was empty. All evening, Ezra had tried to sleep, but he could not close his eyes, partly because the habit of vigilance had sunk deep into his blood after all his time here, but mostly because of the strange presence of the man sharing this cramped cell with him. At last, unable to bear the silence any longer, he softly spoke, his voice just loud enough to pass through the darkness between the two bunks, asking whether the man could sleep, saying that the first night in a place like this was usually the hardest. From above came a short silence, and then that low, calm voice answered that he had been used to sleepless nights for a very long time, that there were places in this world far more likely to rob a man of sleep than this one. Ezra did not fully understand what the words meant, but something in the way the man said them made him shiver, a calm that did not belong to someone hardened by suffering, but to someone who had passed through suffering to its very end and come out on the other side. And Ezra lay still for a while, then blurted out another question, almost in a whisper, asking whether the man truly was not afraid at all, because this place could swallow a person whole, and men like Corrigan were willing to do anything to remind newcomers who held the power. This time, the man did not answer right away. He shifted on the narrow bunk, and when he spoke, his voice was slow, as though he were weighing each word. He said fear was a strange thing, that most of the worst mistakes human beings ever made came from fear rather than courage. People strike too soon because they fear being wounded first. People betray because they fear being left behind. People commit all kinds of cruelty simply because they are trembling inside, and do not dare admit it. He said he had spent almost his whole life watching that in other people, and in himself as well. Then he paused for a moment and added in an even softer voice that as for him, he had nothing left to lose now, and once a person has nothing left to lose, fear has nowhere left to cling. The sentence hung suspended in the darkness, and Ezra felt his spine go cold, not from terror, but because he suddenly realized that this man was speaking a truth so naked that few people would dare say it. He thought about himself, about all those years curled up inside fear, lowering his head, making himself small, doing everything he could to avoid being noticed, and he wondered whether that very fear had turned him into the small man he now was. "What did you do?" Ezra asked. "Out there, I mean?" And the moment the question escaped his mouth, his heart began to pound, because in this world, asking about a man's past was forbidden, the fastest way to invite trouble. But the man did not seem offended. He simply remained silent for a long time, so long that Ezra thought he had fallen asleep. And at last he answered that he had once been responsible for many things and many people, that there were burdens a man carried all his life no matter where he went. He said he had come to this place, not because he was forced in the way people might think, but because some debts could only be paid with one's own freedom, and he had chosen to pay that debt willingly. Ezra could not understand how anyone could willingly enter a place like Ashcroft, but he did not dare ask more, because there was something in the man's voice that made him feel as though he had touched sacred ground where he had no right to step. That night, when Ezra finally drifted into sleep, he carried with him a strange feeling he had not known since the day he first arrived here, a feeling almost like safety, as if the quiet presence of the man lying on the upper bunk were an invisible wall standing between him and every danger waiting outside. And while he sank into sleep, the man still lay awake, gray eyes open wide as he stared into the darkness, speckled with light, silently preparing for the thing he knew with certainty would come the next morning, the moment after which all of Block D would never be the same again. Back in the mess hall, as the hot coffee ran down the stranger's face, the heavy silence broke, only when he slowly set his tray down on the nearest table. Corrigan still stood there with the empty paper cup, waiting for the trembling or begging he had habitually enforced from hundreds of men before. Instead, the quiet man simply wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, looked up with those cold gray water eyes, and spoke softly. He said he only wanted to finish his breakfast in peace and wasn't looking for trouble. To Corrigan, that soft voice was a slap against his decade-long authority. Left with no choice in front of his crew, Corrigan roared and swung his fist at the man, a punch carrying the full weight of his massive body, the kind of punch that had dropped many men where they stood. But that punch touched only empty air. The man was no longer where Corrigan had aimed. He leaned aside with a movement so small it was almost impossible to see, borrowed the force of Corrigan's own charge to throw him off balance. And with only one decisive turn of the wrist and a push placed at precisely the right point, the huge man who had ruled Block D for nearly 10 years collapsed to the floor, like a tower whose foundation had been pulled away. Everything happened so quickly that many men in the cafeteria did not even have time to see it. They only heard the heavy thud of Corrigan's body striking the floor, and then silence fell, thick, stunned, and disbelieving. Corrigan's men took several seconds to understand what had just happened, and when they did, anger mixed with panic drove them forward, all at once, 3 or 4 men rushing in from different sides, meaning to overwhelm the man with numbers, but he did not seem hurried at all. He moved among them with cold restraint, not one wasted motion, not one strike meant for display, only movements so precise they were almost ruthless, each contact aimed at exactly the point that made the other man unable to continue without causing unnecessary damage. One man's arm was locked, and he was pinned down before he could throw a second punch. Another rushed in too hard, and was carried by his own momentum straight into the edge of a metal table. The third stopped halfway, and one look from the man was enough to make his legs seem rooted to the floor. In less time than an ordinary person could count to 3, the order that had seemed untouchable in Block D had shattered in the middle of the cafeteria before hundreds of watching eyes. The man straightened, adjusted the collar of his prison shirt, now soaked with coffee, and looked once around the room, not with the eyes of a victor seeking applause, but with the sorrowful gaze of someone who had just been forced to do something he had never wanted to do. He bent down, silently picked up his spilled tray, then walked to the food line for another serving, and went to an empty table in the corner, sat down, and began eating breakfast as if the 3 men sprawled on the floor had nothing to do with him. From the other side of the corridor leading into the cafeteria, behind the thick glass of the security door, Delphine Marchetti stood frozen, the file she held against her chest having slipped lower without her realizing it. She had just been passing by on her way to the therapy room when she caught the entire scene through the glass, and now her heart was pounding inside her chest. In 2 years of working at Ashcroft, she had witnessed no small amount of violence, had read countless files recording the worst things human beings could do to one another. But what she had just seen was unlike anything before. There was no frenzy, no chaos, none of the blind aggression she had grown too accustomed to. There was only a chilling calm, an absolute control, carried out by a man who seemed not to want to hurt anyone at all. And what unsettled her most What made it impossible for her to look away from the figure now sitting quietly in the corner eating was the vague but persistent feeling that behind that composure lay a story far deeper than anything a sentence or a file could tell her, a story that, though she did not yet know it, she was about to become part of. Less than an hour after the cafeteria returned to its strained quiet, the man was taken to solitary confinement, the place cut off from the rest of the prison, where light was even rarer and silence was thicker than anywhere else in Ashcroft. He did not object, did not explain himself, only let them lead him away in silence and sat down on the narrow bed in the bare room, his hands resting on his knees, his gray eyes fixed on the wall before him, with the thoughtful look of a man who had already foreseen every consequence and accepted them long ago. Meanwhile, in her office in the administrative wing, Warden Coralie Fontaine sat before her computer screen, with a cup of cold coffee forgotten beside her, trying to piece together the fragments of the chaotic morning that had just passed. She had worked in corrections for nearly 20 years, had lived through nearly every kind of upheaval a prison could produce, and she took pride in the fact that very few things could still truly surprise her. But the report lying on her desk now was different. 3 inmates brought down in a matter of seconds, one of them Corrigan, the name no one had dared touch for nearly a decade, all by the hand of a man who had been admitted less than a day earlier, a man with no recorded history of violence in his intake file. Something did not fit, and Coralie Fontaine was the kind of person who could not rest when something did not fit. She reopened the new inmate's file, the file no one had studied carefully during intake, and began reading it again from the beginning, slowly and meticulously. The name Salvatore Bianchi appeared on the screen, along with a sentence for a series of charges connected to financial crimes and organized operations, dry offenses written in the cold language of the law that said very little about the real person behind them. But when she entered that name into the federal database, the screen began returning page after page, and Coralie Fontaine's face gradually hardened. She had heard the name Bianchi before, not in any prison file but in news fragments, in murmured rumors among law enforcement circles, for years about an underground force controlling an entire stretch of coastline from Providence up to Boston, a name people always spoke with caution because no one had ever managed to touch its summit. And now that summit, the man who had once stood above it all, was sitting in her solitary unit, wearing the same gray prison uniform as any other inmate. Coralie Fontaine leaned back in her chair and let out a long breath, feeling the weight of what she had just discovered settle on her shoulders. She understood that once this information spread, and it certainly would spread, because no wall in Ashcroft was thick enough to hold it back, the long-standing balance of power inside the prison would be completely overturned, and she was not wrong. The truth about the quiet man's real identity began leaking out that very afternoon, passing from one mouth to another ear, through the invisible cracks, through which prison information always found a way to seep, and each time it was retold, the story grew heavier. Some whispered that the newcomer had once commanded hundreds of men with nothing more than a nod. Others swore that the hardest men they had ever known on the outside would lower themselves when speaking his name. Still others said that his imprisonment was only something he had allowed to happen, because a man like him could not be held by any wall unless he wanted to be. In the cell blocks, the atmosphere changed in a way no one could miss. The men who had lowered their heads to Corrigan, day after day now stood confused, unsure where their loyalty should go. Corrigan's followers scattered like bees without a queen, and the opportunists had already begun calculating how they might use this earthquake for themselves. Even the guards began looking toward the solitary unit with a new caution, because they understood that the man locked inside was no ordinary prisoner, but something none of them truly knew how to handle. As for Coralie Fontaine, when night fell and she remained in her office beneath the only light shining down on the stack of files, she could not push away the question that kept returning to her mind, a question that even all her years of experience could not answer. Why would a man who had held everything, power, fear, and pathways to avoid almost any sentence, voluntarily step into this place and accept the loss of his freedom, as if he himself were the one who longed to be behind bars more than anyone else? And she sensed, as with the sharp instinct of someone who had spent her life observing human beings, that the answer to that question would be far darker and deeper than anything the file could reveal. In the stillness of solitary confinement that night, when the whole prison had sunk into a heavy sleep, and only the steady footsteps of the guard on duty echoed faintly from far away, Salvatore Bianchi sat motionless on the narrow bed, and for the first time since passing through Ashcroft's gates, he allowed memory to flood back, the memory he had spent so many years trying to lock away in the deepest corner of his mind, though it had never truly slept through a single night. He remembered his younger brother Nico, the only person in this world who had still called him by the name of his childhood, the one Salvatore had sworn to himself he would protect at any cost from the day their parents passed away, leaving the two brothers alone in a world that never showed mercy to those without anyone. Nico was a few years younger than him and carried within himself a gentleness for which the world they had grown up in had no room, a soul who might have become something good if fate had placed him somewhere else, in another life. Salvatore had climbed to the top of that underground empire, partly because of ambition, but mostly, or so he had always told himself, to build a wall high enough and strong enough to shield his only brother from the dangers waiting on every side. He had believed, with all the arrogance of a man holding too much power in his hands, that if he was strong enough, feared enough, then nothing could touch the people he loved. But power, as he had paid dearly to understand, always dragged shadows behind it, and those shadows never aimed at the strong. They always searched for the softest place. On that fateful night, when the struggle for territory among rival forces rose into a bloody confrontation, Salvatore's enemies did not come for him. They came for Nico. He still remembered with cruel clarity the moment he received the news, the feeling of the ground giving way beneath his feet, the way time seemed to stop as he raced through the night with a terror that no power, no empire could soothe. He arrived, but he arrived too late. He held his younger brother in his arms in that cold, dark alley, and in those final seconds, Nico looked at him not with blame, but with something far more painful, a gaze of forgiveness, as if even in that moment he still loved the brother who had spent his whole life trying to protect him, and in the end had failed. Salvatore knelt in that alley for a very long time, so long he could no longer remember how much time had passed, and when he finally stood, something inside him had changed forever. The power he had once believed to be a shield of protection had turned out to be the very thing that had signed the death sentence of the person he loved most. Every order he had ever given, every fear he had ever planted, every price that nameless people had paid for his rule, all of it suddenly rose before his eyes with merciless clarity. He realized that for all those years, he had caused other families the very same pain that was now tearing his own heart apart, that somewhere out there, countless brothers, fathers and sons had knelt in other dark alleys because of the world he ruled. From that night on, Salvatore Bianchi was no longer the same man. He began dismantling the very empire he had built, quietly and carefully, setting strict limits he had never cared about before, ruthlessly casting out any man under him who dared use violence against innocent people, people who had nothing to do with their game, and in the long sleepless nights, he turned to a strange habit no one knew about. He began writing letters to Nico, letters that would never be sent, never have a living receiver, and in them he told his brother about the things he was trying to repair, about the burden he carried, about the fragile hope that one day he might atone for even a small part of what he had done. Writing to the dead was the only way he found to face the things he could not speak aloud, and through the years, those letters became the place where he kept everything most honest that still remained inside a man the whole world knew only as a frightening name. Sitting in Ashcroft's solitary unit that night, Salvatore Bianchi quietly closed his eyes, and he knew that the road that had brought him here, the decision to willingly lose his freedom, had in truth begun on that fateful night in the alley long ago, when he held his fading brother in his arms and swore to his spirit that he would spend the rest of his life not ruling, but repaying a debt. Under Ashcroft regulations, any inmate involved in a serious violent incident was required to undergo a psychological evaluation before the administration decided on the next steps, and so, 3 days after what happened in the cafeteria, the name Salvatore Bianchi appeared on Delphine Marchetti's schedule. She looked at that name for a long time before the appointment, and an uncomfortable feeling was inside her that she could not push away. She had read his file, had seen the charges connected to organized operations, the kind of file she instinctively always wanted to pass on to someone else, but this time she had no choice. This evaluation was mandatory, and it had been assigned to her. When they brought him into the cramped therapy room and left the two of them alone, separated only by the metal table bolted to the floor, Delphine kept her face cool and professional, but beneath that calm appearance was a rigid defensiveness she rarely felt with any other client. Because the man sitting before her was not only an inmate, he was the embodiment of the very world she had spent her whole life avoiding, the world of men who used power and money to trample over small people, the world that made an old wound inside her ache every time she touched it. She opened the file, picked up her pen, and began with dry procedural questions, her voice even, distant, carrying none of the warmth of empathy she usually offered to the people who sat in that chair. Salvatore answered each question briefly and clearly, without evasion and without rambling. He did not try to justify what had happened in the cafeteria, did not blame Corrigan, did not recount the provocation he had endured, and did not try to paint himself as a pitiful victim the way most others did when they sat before her. He simply acknowledged what he had done, and when Delphine asked whether he regretted the act, he was silent for a moment before answering that he regretted having been forced to do it, but he did not regret defending his right to be left in peace, and that in his experience, sometimes human beings understood only one language, sad as that was. That answer made Delphine look up at him, and in the instant their eyes met, she caught something that unsettled her. She had prepared herself to face the arrogance of a powerful man, the cold indifference of a hardened criminal, but what she saw in those gray eyes was not that at all. There was a deep sorrow there, the weariness of someone who had carried a burden for too long, and something almost like understanding, as if he were looking through the professional armor she wore, and seeing even the things she was trying to hide. The feeling made her uncomfortable, and she quickly lowered her eyes to write, cutting off that gaze. But there was something stranger still that Delphine could not help noticing. Throughout the conversation, she caught Salvatore looking at her, in an unusual way more than once, not with scrutiny or judgment, but with a faint hesitation, almost confusion, as though something about her had made him pause, as though he were trying to search his memory for a missing piece he could not name. Each time, he would furrow his brow slightly and then let it pass, and Delphine told herself she must be imagining it, because she and this man had clearly never had any connection at all. Two people from two opposing worlds so distant that there could not possibly be any common ground between them. When the evaluation ended and she closed the file, Delphine said in her practiced cold voice that she would complete the report and send it to the administration, that this was only a procedure and she hoped he understood that. Salvatore stood, and before he was led away, he paused for a moment, looked at her with those calm eyes, and said softly that he could feel she carried something heavy inside. That sometimes the people who spend their lives healing others are the very ones carrying wounds that have never been touched. That sentence made Delphine freeze, her heart tightening painfully, because it had touched the very thing she had never allowed anyone to see. She gave no answer, only tightened her grip on the folder and turned away. But when the door closed behind him, she stood for a long time in the empty room, and for the first time in many years, she felt that the shell she had worked so hard to build had just been lightly touched by a stranger, and it left her angry, afraid, and strangely bewildered. Corrigan's collapse did not bring the peace that many had secretly hoped for. Instead, it opened the door to something even more frightening than his rule, and that was chaos. For nearly 10 years, all of Block D had operated under one single order, a cruel order, but at least one that could be predicted, where everyone knew his boundaries, knew who held power, and knew the risks of crossing the line. But now, with the name that had once made everyone lower their heads lying in the infirmary, with wounds not yet healed and an authority shattered beyond repair, that order fell apart in only a few days, leaving behind an empty space into which countless hands immediately reached to fight for control. The smaller gangs that had always crouched beneath Corrigan's shadow suddenly lifted their heads, each group believing this was the chance of a lifetime to rise and seize the vacant place. Corrigan's former men split into several factions, each gathering around some self-declared leader, and before long, clashes began breaking out everywhere. A few words exchanged at mealtime could instantly become a fight. A look believed to be a challenge could light the fuse for an entire brawl. Old debts and old grudges that had once been suppressed beneath Corrigan's authority, were now dragged out and settled openly and recklessly. Because there was no longer anyone strong enough to draw the boundaries for everyone, violence in Block D rose to such a level that even the most seasoned guards could only shake their heads in weary disbelief. The number of incidents recorded each day was several times higher than during Corrigan's reign. The prison infirmary was always overloaded, and the atmosphere in the cell rows became stretched tight as a violin string about to snap, with everyone living in fear, never knowing from which direction disaster would come. The bitter irony was that under Corrigan's rule of fear, the prison had at least maintained an outward appearance of order, but now that the yoke had been lifted, what rose in its place was a lawlessness far more dangerous. The administration quickly realized it was losing control. Warden Coralie Fontaine called meeting after meeting, trying to find a solution, but every ordinary measure proved useless. Tightening discipline, increasing patrols, restricting common hours, all of it only poured more oil onto the fire, making the anger among the inmates press down harder and wait to erupt more violently. What the prison was facing was not one single leader who could be isolated or restrained, but a spreading collapse, a struggle without end among too many small forces all hungry for power. She understood that if this continued, sooner or later a true tragedy would happen, something serious enough that there would be no way to undo it. The irony, and also the thing that kept Coralie Fontaine awake most of all, was that the only person all of Block D still seemed to fear, the only person no gang dared touch, was sitting quietly in solitary confinement, completely separated from the storm tearing through the outside world. Since the cafeteria incident, Salvatore Bianchi's name had become a silent legend inside the prison, and even amid the chaos of competing factions, not a single self-declared leader dared mention challenging him, as though all of them understood without saying it that he belonged to an entirely different class, a force they were not qualified to face. His presence, even indirectly and from a distance, still cast an invisible shadow over all of Block D, and Coralie Fontaine could not fail to recognize that, but she was also a woman who worked by principle, and the thought of relying on a mafia boss to restore order in her prison disturbed her deeply. She knew very well that men like Salvatore Bianchi operated by their own laws, and giving someone like that any form of official influence could be a disastrous mistake, a gamble she did not dare take. So she chose to wait, continuing to wrestle with the crisis using the few tools she had, never knowing that the solution she was desperately searching for would not come from any order or policy of the administration, but would begin to take root in a place entirely unexpected, in the very cramped therapy room where a wounded woman and a man seeking redemption had just met for the first time. Only a few days later, the administrations decided to move Salvatore out of solitary confinement and return him to Block D, partly because his term in isolation had ended, and partly because in the middle of this turmoil, they no longer had enough empty space to keep him separated any longer. And it was during those first days back in the heart of that chaos that he noticed a young man named Milo. Milo was only 19, just old enough to be sent into a place for adults like Ashcroft, and he had been convicted for a series of petty thefts, the kind of crime behind which there was often a sad story of poverty and the wrong choices of youth rather than any truly evil nature. He was thin and awkward, with eyes that still held the bewilderment of someone who had not yet understood how his life had slipped this far, and in the harsh world of Block D, someone like Milo was no different from perfect prey. When Corrigan still held power, there had at least been a certain order that kept the weak from being torn apart at random, but now, amid the chaos of the struggle for control, men like Milo became easy targets for the newly rising gangs to vent their anger and show off their strength. One afternoon, in the common yard during recreation hour, Salvatore saw a group of men corner Milo against the wall, snatching away his small portion of food and a few personal items, shoving him back and forth among them, as though he were nothing more than a toy for their amusement. Milo did not dare fight back. He only tried to shrink into himself, both hands covering his head, enduring in silence with the resigned look of someone who had grown used to being treated that way, and it was precisely that resignation that made Salvatore's heart grow heavy. He did not charge in loudly the way people might have imagined. He simply walked over, slow and calm, stood between Milo and the men, then spoke in his familiar low voice, saying this boy was not worth the trouble, that they had more important things to worry about. He did not raise his voice, he did not threaten them, but his presence alone, together with the reputation that had already spread throughout the prison, was enough to make those men stop. They looked at him, then at one another, and in their eyes, the aggression from moments before quickly gave way to a caution they could not hide. After a brief hesitation, they muttered a few words to save face and drifted away, leaving Milo still trembling against the wall. Salvatore turned to him, picked up the scattered items from the ground, handed them back, and asked whether he was all right in a voice so gentle it startled Milo, because in all his time here, no one had ever asked him a question like that. The boy stammered his thanks, his eyes still wet, and looked at the man before him with the gaze of someone who had just had a hand extended to pull him up from an abyss. From that day on, Milo began clinging to Salvatore like a small shadow, following him during common hours, sitting near him in the cafeteria, searching for every chance to remain beside that steady presence that, for the first time in his life, made him feel safe. At first, Salvatore simply let him stay there in silence, neither driving him away nor encouraging him, but little by little, something in the young man's bewildered, wounded eyes touched a deep place inside him, a place he had long kept locked away. Because every time he looked at Milo, Salvatore saw the faint outline of someone else, another young person who had also carried a gentleness unsuited to the cruel world around him, someone he had not been able to protect. He did not say this aloud, and perhaps he himself did not yet fully understand it, but in the way he quietly kept an eye on Milo, made sure the boy had enough food, and taught him how to stay away from troubles that were not worth touching, there was something almost like atonement, as if by sheltering this strange young man, he was trying to make up for everything he had lost, and Milo, for his part, became the first person in the prison to see Salvatore Bianchi not as a terrifying mafia boss or a cold legend, but as a human being, a man with a heart hidden behind his quiet shell, someone willing to stand up for the weak without asking for anything in return, and that silent bond which no one could have expected would become one of the most important threads of fate in all that was about to unfold. While the chaos continued sweeping through Block D, and the administration struggled with harsh measures that only made the situation worse, Delphine Marchetti brought forward a proposal that at first many members of the warden's staff considered so naive it was almost laughable. She proposed opening a group therapy program for the inmates of Block D, a space where they could sit together and learn to recognize and control the anger that was driving the whole block into a spiral of violence, instead of continuing to pour it onto one another. She argued that the root of the crisis did not lie in a lack of discipline, but in the fear and despair rising inside every person locked behind these walls, and that one could not put out a fire by adding more pressure to it. Coralie Fontaine was skeptical at first, because in the midst of such a volatile situation, the idea of healing conversations sounded distant and impractical, but when every familiar tool had already failed and she had nothing left to lose, she reluctantly nodded and allowed Delphine to try it, though in her heart she placed very little hope in it. The first group therapy session took place in the prison's small library, with a selected group of inmates, most of whom had joined unwillingly, sitting in a loose circle with skeptical faces and arms folded tightly across their chests. The air at first was heavy and full of caution. No one wanted to be the first to speak, and Delphine could clearly feel the resistance radiating from every person in the room. Then the door opened, and Salvatore Bianchi stepped in, because he too was on the list of required participants, partly because of the psychological evaluation after the cafeteria incident, and partly because the administration wanted to keep him within sight. When he silently sat down in an empty chair in the circle, the atmosphere in the room changed at once. The inmates who had been slouching with indifference suddenly straightened, furtive glances turned toward him, and a different kind of silence settled over the room, no longer the silence of resistance, but the silence of people waiting. Delphine noticed it immediately, and it left her both surprised and somewhat unsettled. She had prepared herself to struggle through the entire session, just to draw a few words out of these closed-off men. Yet the mere presence of one man who had not spoken a single word carried more weight than all the professional techniques she had brought with her. When she asked the first question, about what made them feel most angry and powerless in life here, and no one bothered to answer, it was Salvatore who broke the silence. He did not raise his voice to preach. nor did he speak about himself. He only said softly that he had lived long enough to understand that anger was often only the mask fear wore, so it did not have to show its face, and that the man shouting the loudest in the room was often the one most afraid and least willing to admit it. Those words, spoken by someone they all feared and respected, carried a power that, had they come from Delphine's mouth, would almost certainly have been brushed aside at once. A few inmates began to shift, then hesitantly speak, at first in scattered, guarded words, but little by little, the door she had spent the whole session trying to knock on began to open. Delphine stood there, watching what was unfolding with a conflicted feeling pulling at her from both sides. One part of her, the part that belonged to a healer, could not deny that this man had just done what she had thought impossible, that he was becoming the key that opened the door for the whole room. But another part of her, the part filled with prejudice and old wounds, felt uneasy and unsettled at having to admit that the success of the program she cared about depended on the influence of a man who came from the very world she hated. She told herself he was only a participant like everyone else, that he held no role or authority whatsoever in her program, and she clung to that thought as a way to preserve the boundary she had drawn. But when the session ended and the inmates left one by one, their faces somewhat softer than when they had entered, Delphine could not help recognizing that, whether she wanted to admit it or not, something had just begun, a reluctant and deeply paradoxical collaboration between two people standing on opposite shores, and that the road ahead, though she could not yet imagine it, would force her to face the very things she had spent her entire life running from. The group therapy sessions gradually became a steady part of Block D's rhythm, and with them, a small but real change began to slip into the prison's suffocating air. Though Delphine still kept a careful distance from the man whose relationship to her she could not yet name. She still treated Salvatore with a professional and somewhat cold manner, still raised between them the invisible boundary she considered a shield to protect herself. But there were moments and small details that began to make that boundary tremble in ways she had not expected. One afternoon, after a therapy session had just ended, and everyone had begun filing out of the library, Delphine realized she had forgotten the most important file on the table in the corner, the file containing private notes about each client, something that could cause countless problems if it fell into the wrong hands. She hurried back to look for it, her heart full of worry, and when she stepped into the room, now almost empty, she saw that Salvatore had remained behind. He was standing beside the table, the file still intact in his hand, and for one instant her first reflex was suspicion. The thought that a man like him must have taken the chance to read what was inside. But Salvatore only silently held the file out to her, and said in his low, steady voice that he had seen it left behind, and thought it was important to her, so he had stayed to make sure no one else touched it before she returned. He added, almost in passing, that the things people entrusted to one's care should not be violated, under any circumstance, and the way he said it, without the slightest display or expectation of praise, made Delphine stand still. She took the file back, thanked him softly, and when he gave her a nod of farewell and quietly walked out of the room, she remained there for a long time, holding the file in her hands while emotions she could not name tangled inside her. Because that action, however small it might have been, had struck directly against the prejudice she had carried for so many years. She had grown used to thinking of people from his world as men who only knew how to take, trample, and exploit, men for whom trust was a luxury that did not exist. And yet this man had just done something entirely opposite, something kind without gain, simply because it was the right thing to do. For many days afterward, that moment kept returning again and again to Delphine's mind, and she began to notice things she had once deliberately ignored. She noticed the way Salvatore quietly kept watch over Milo, making sure that thin young man was not bullied by anyone, and always had enough food. She noticed the way the other inmates, even the most stubborn ones, gradually changed their behavior when they were near him, not because of fear, but because of something close to respect. She noticed that among all the men sitting in the therapy circle, he was the one who spoke the least about himself, yet he was the one who listened to others most attentively, with a patience and understanding she rarely encountered even among colleagues in her own profession. One detail at a time, they came together into a picture that did not fit the image she had already built in her mind of a cold and ruthless Mafia boss and that mismatch left her confused. Delphine was a woman of science. She had been trained to observe, to compare, to refuse to let prejudice obscure what was plainly before her eyes. And now that very training was forcing her to face an uncomfortable question she did not want to answer. Could she have been wrong to place every person from that world into the same mold, to judge a man she had never truly tried to understand? She was not ready to let go of her prejudice, because that prejudice was tied to a pain too deep and too old to be easily unraveled. But for the first time in all those years, a small crack had appeared in the wall she had built. A fragile ray of light slipped through that crack, and no matter how hard she tried to deny it, she knew that the way she looked at the quiet man had begun to change, slowly and irreversibly, like ice beginning to melt beneath the first rays of a spring people had believed would never come. Over time, the group therapy sessions in that small library gradually became something no one in the prison, not even Delphine, had ever dared dream of. The loose circle with folded arms and guarded eyes from the first session had now become a space where people who seemed to have lost all ability to feel began learning again how to speak aloud the things stored up inside them. And in the middle of that quiet transformation, Salvatore never once placed himself in the role of a teacher or a leader. He simply shared, when asked, the things that a whole lifetime of experience had taught him. He told them that true strength did not lie in the ability to make others afraid, because he had once held all that kind of power in his hands and had seen with his own eyes that it saved nothing that truly mattered. He said the hardest thing a person had to do was not fight back against someone else, but sit still and dare to look straight into his own fear without turning away. When a young inmate angrily recounted how he had almost rushed into a fight because of a look he believed was provocative, Salvatore did not scold him. He only asked what had truly made him so angry, and patiently guided him until the young man realized for himself that what had made him react so violently was not that look, but the fear of being looked down on, the fear of seeming weak in the eyes of others, a fear that had followed him from long before he ever set foot in Ashcroft. Conversations like that went on, session after session, and Delphine gradually realized that what Salvatore was doing did not oppose her expertise at all, but strangely enough, it supported it, because he reached those men through the kind of credibility that only someone who had walked to the very end of darkness could possess. The clearest change, and the one that softened her heart the most, was in Milo, the young man who had once curled into himself in fear, who had once endured being shoved around like an object, now began lifting his head a little higher each day. He was still gentle, still held on to the softness that belonged to him, but within that gentleness there was now something steadier, a young confidence he had learned from watching Salvatore, from the way that man faced everything with calm instead of panic. Milo began taking part in the therapy sessions willingly, and there was even a time when he stepped forward on his own to stop an argument between two other inmates, doing exactly what he had learned, and when Delphine witnessed it, she had to turn away to hide the sudden sting in her eyes. And the most miraculous thing was that this transformation did not stop within the four walls of the library. It began spreading through Block D, like ripples across the surface of water. The inmates who attended the therapy sessions carried what they had learned back to the cell rows, and little by little, the spiral of violence that had once dragged the whole block down began to slow. Clashes became less frequent. Small grudges were resolved with words instead of fists. The number of incidents the guards had to record each day dropped so clearly that even they were astonished, and the suffocating atmosphere that had weighed over Block D for so long seemed to loosen, one small degree at a time. Warden Coralie Fontaine watched the statistics with an initial skepticism that gradually turned into cautious faith, because the thing she had desperately searched for through every harsh measure was quietly taking shape in the place she had least expected. But even during those rare days when a fragile ray of hope began to glimmer inside Ashcroft, there were still shadows silently drawing near. Through the cracks of the underground information network that never stopped flowing through the prison, a rumor began passing from one cell row to another, a rumor that made even the hardest inmates lower their voices when they spoke of it. People murmured that a new transfer group was coming soon, and among the names to be brought to Ashcroft was someone called Oz Vance, a man whose dark reputation had traveled ahead of him through no one knew how many other prison walls. They said he was the kind of man who did not know what fear was, the kind of man for whom violence was not a tool but almost an instinct, and that every place he had passed through had been left with a long trail of ruin and terror behind it. That rumor slipped into Block D just when everything seemed to be getting better, planting a vague unease in the hearts of people who had only just begun to feel a little hope, and though no one yet knew for certain what was waiting ahead, Salvatore, with the sharp instinct of someone far too familiar with how darkness worked, understood that the fragile peace they had all just built was about to face a harsher test than anything that had come before. Before the shadow named Oz Vance could set foot in Ashcroft, another storm had already begun to gather deep inside Block D, and it came from the men Salvatore had unwittingly pushed into darkness from the day Corrigan fell. The old followers of Corrigan, men who had once lived off their boss's authority and now had lost both status and profit, had quietly come together again. They could not accept the truth that the entire order that had fed them had been broken by a man who arrived later, and they could bear even less the sight of Block D, gradually changing in a direction that made their brute strength meaningless. To them, the peace beginning to flicker was not hope, but a direct threat to their survival, and in desperation mixed with hatred, they decided they had to do something to reclaim what they had lost, to prove that the age of violence was not over yet. Their chance came during work hours, in the machine shop behind the prison, a wide space tangled with rows of old machinery, towering iron shelves loaded with tools, and narrow aisles winding between blocks of heavy equipment. It was the place the guards visited least often, the place where the noise of machines could cover almost any sound, and they had calculated carefully in order to drive Salvatore into that exact space. When he entered the shop according to his usual work schedule, he immediately sensed something wrong in the air, the forced silence of men waiting, and when he looked up, he saw them, nearly 20 men who had quietly surrounded him, blocking every exit, their faces heavy with murderous intent. The leader, a broad-shouldered man, who had once been Corrigan's right hand, stepped forward and declared in a growling voice that it was time for Salvatore to pay for what he had done, that no one would come to save him today. But Salvatore did not seem panicked. He stood still in the middle of the circle, his eyes moving once across the faces surrounding him, and when he spoke, his voice was so calm that it formed a strange contrast with the tension closing in around him. He said he understood their anger, understood the feeling of having something they once possessed taken away, because he too had lost things more precious than anything they could imagine. He said that if what they truly wanted was to rush at him, then many men would be lying on the floor of this shop today, and most of them would be themselves. But he asked whether that would bring back even a small part of what they had lost, or whether it would only make everything worse. He slowly stepped back between 2 rows of tall iron shelves, a position he had calculated in an instant, where the narrow space would keep the crowd from swarming him all at once, where their advantage in numbers was almost completely neutralized, forcing them to face him one by one. It was the move of a man who understood that in a confrontation, terrain was sometimes even more important than strength. A few of the most hot-headed men still charged forward, and Salvatore had dealt with them with the same cold restraint that all of Block D had once witnessed. Not one wasted strike, not one trace of unnecessary aggression, only decisive movements aimed precisely at the places that stopped an opponent from continuing. And then he stopped, never pushing the matter further than necessary. But most of his true power in that moment did not lie in the blows he gave, but in the calm authority that came from the man himself, in the way he kept absolute composure even while surrounded by nearly 20 enemies. One by one, the men who had been most aggressive began to hesitate, their anger cooling as they realized that this man was not afraid of them, that he could make them pay dearly if he wanted to, yet chose not to do so. And that very choice not to spill blood, that restraint none of them had ever seen in a powerful man, did what no punch could have done. It made them feel ashamed. When the guards finally rushed in after hearing unusual noises, they witnessed a scene that left them stunned. Nearly 20 men who had planned an ambush now standing silent with lowered heads, not one of them badly hurt, and in the middle of it all was the quiet man still standing straight, his face showing no triumph, only a faint, weary sadness, as though he had once again been forced to prove to the world something that should not have needed proving, that the greatest power a human being possesses is not the ability to destroy others, but the ability to hold himself back from doing it. That night, after leaving Ashcroft and returning to her small apartment in the city, Delphine sat by the window with a cup of tea gone cold in her hands. And for reasons she did not understand, perhaps because of everything she had witnessed over the past weeks, her mind drifted back to a place she had tried not to think about for so many years. She remembered the little bakery on the street corner, the place where she had grown up during the earliest years of her life, the place where every morning began very early, before the sky had even brightened, and the whole street was still sunk in sleep. She remembered the warm smell of flour and yeast mingling in the air, that unmistakable scent that had soaked into every grain of wood and every brick of the bakery. And even now, whenever she happened to catch it somewhere, her heart would tighten with an unnamed longing. She remembered the shape of her father standing beside the oven, his hands dusted with flour, his gentle face always breaking into a smile whenever he turned to look at the little girl sitting on the stool in the corner of the kitchen, watching every movement he made with wide eyes full of admiration. Her father had been a kind and hard-working man, a man who believed in simple things, believed that if one worked hard and remained kind, life would eventually be kind in return. He often saved her little scraps of dough so she could shape them into funny little figures, and he would pretend to marvel at those clumsy creations as though they were true masterpieces, making her giggle with the pure happiness only childhood can give. She remembered his apron, the faded blue apron hanging on the wooden peg beside the door, the thing he put on every morning before beginning a day's work and carefully hung back in the same place every night. To the little Delphine of those days, the apron on the peg was an image tied to safety, to the feeling that as long as it remained there, everything in her small world was still whole. That bakery was not wealthy, and her family had never had much to spare, but, in her memory, it was the warmest and most complete time of her entire life, a patch of peace that she would spend the rest of her years longing to find again and never be able to. Because then one day, that peace vanished. She still remembered the evening when the bakery no longer glowed with light as it usually did, the sudden and strange silence that covered the house, the vague feeling of a child realizing that something terrible had just happened, though she was not yet old enough to fully understand it. She remembered the faded blue apron still hanging motionless on the wooden peg, but the man who wore it every morning never came home again. The oven gradually grew cold, and then went dark completely. The smell of flour and yeast faded day by day, until nothing remained but a silent emptiness, and the small warm world she had once believed unchanging collapsed in a single night, leaving a little girl alone in life with no one left to lean on. What happened afterward, she had learned how not to remember, the years when she was passed from one place to another, the lost feeling of a child who belonged nowhere, and the quiet determination she nurtured to rise by herself from the ashes of her childhood. But what she could never forget, the thing that had shaped the person she was today, was the bitter understanding that her father, a gentle man who had never harmed anyone, had been stolen by the very world of men who used strength as an excuse to trample over small people. The world that now, after all these years, she had to face every day through the bars of Ashcroft. Sitting by the window in that still late night, Delphine realized that the hatred she had carried for so long, the reflex to pull away whenever she touched files bearing the shadow of that world, all of it came from the faded blue apron hanging silently on the wooden peg, never to be worn again. And for the first time in many years, when the image of the quiet man at Ashcroft suddenly rose in her mind, she felt a conflict she was not ready to name, because that man belonged to the very world that had taken her father from her. And yet everything she had seen in him was slowly shaking. Day by day, the things she had believed were nailed forever into her heart. A few days later, during a private conversation between the two of them after the group therapy session had ended, something unexpected happened, something neither of them had prepared for. Since the moment Salvatore returned the forgotten file, a cautious but more sincere kind of dialogue had begun to form between them, brief conversations in which Delphine, though still keeping her distance, had begun allowing herself to treat him as a human being rather than a label. That afternoon, the conversation drifted by chance toward the subject of the past, toward the things that had led each person onto the path they had taken, and perhaps because of the quiet atmosphere of late afternoon, or because the calm presence of the man before her made her lower her guard. Delphine let a fragment of memory slip out without meaning to. She mentioned the small bakery where she had grown up, mentioned the street where it had stood, the name of the street she had not spoken aloud in so many years, and she mentioned the year when everything in her life had shattered, the year her father left this world and left her alone. She said those things in passing, almost casually, with no intention of sharing anything deeply, only as an unconscious way of explaining why she had chosen the work of healing people society had cast aside. But the moment those names in that year left her lips, she noticed a change on Salvatore's face that she had never seen before. The man who had always kept absolute composure in every circumstance, the man who had stood straight in the middle of nearly 20 enemies without blinking, suddenly went still. Those gray eyes usually as calm as the surface of a lake in the morning, briefly stirred with something, a hidden shock he suppressed at once, but not quickly enough for her to miss it. His hand, resting lightly on the metal table, tightened for a moment and then released. He said nothing, but his silence now was completely different from his usual calm silence. It was the silence of a man who had just been pierced by something from the past, without having time to defend himself. Delphine paused, sensing the change though she did not understand its reason, and she asked whether he was all right, her voice tinged with confusion. It took Salvatore a moment to answer, and when he spoke, there was something unusually strained in his voice. He only said he was fine, that the name of that street had suddenly reminded him of something that had happened long ago. But his eyes betrayed his words, because they now held something so heavy that Delphine, with the sharp sensitivity of her profession, understood he was concealing an emotion far larger than he admitted. Inside Salvatore's mind at that moment, a storm was surging violently behind his composed exterior. The name of the street, that year, the image of a small bakery on the corner. All of it suddenly fitted together with a dark memory he had buried deep, one of the countless reports that had once been brought to him, incidents that in those days he had only skimmed like lifeless numbers inside the enormous machinery of power he operated. He did not yet dare be completely certain. His mind was resisting the terrible conclusion, slowly taking shape, but an invisible thread had just been tied between the woman sitting before him, the wounded woman he had gradually come to care for and respect, and a dark corner of the very past he was trying day and night to atone for. He looked at Delphine, looked for a long time into those weary brown eyes, and for the first time he understood why, from their very first meeting, he had felt that strange sense that her face awakened something in him, a vague connection he could not name. Now the final piece was slowly falling into its proper place, and the picture that emerged made his heart twist. He knew, with a certainty growing stronger by the second, that the pain that had shaped this woman's life, the pain that made her avoid files bearing the shadow of his world, very likely began in the very world at whose summit he had once stood, and in that moment Salvatore Bianchi, the man who had faced death without flinching, suddenly felt true fear for the first time in many years, the fear that the truth he had just glimpsed, once spoken aloud, would forever destroy the fragile thread that had only just begun to grow between two people, and would make the woman he had started to treasure endure one more wound. For many days afterward, Salvatore carried that newly revealed truth inside him like a boulder, and he knew he stood before a choice he could not avoid. He could remain silent, bury what he had realized, and continue the fragile relationship that had only just begun to grow with Delphine, as though nothing had ever happened. That would be the easier road, the less painful road for both of them. But Salvatore had spent the rest of his life learning how to live differently, learning to become a man who no longer hid from difficult truths, and he understood that atonement built on concealment was no different from a house raised on sand. She deserved to know the truth, no matter how cruel that truth might be, and he had no right to take that away from her just to protect his own peace. And so, one afternoon, when only the two of them remained in the cramped therapy room, he was the one who spoke first. He told her there was something he needed to say, something he knew would hurt her, and that he asked only for her to hear him through to the end before deciding what to do with what she had heard. Delphine looked at him in confusion, but there was something in his unusual gravity that made her fall silent and wait. Salvatore began to tell the story, slowly and without evasion, about the world he had once ruled, and about a rule he had set after a loss of his own, an absolute rule that no one under him was allowed to use violence against innocent people, ordinary citizens who had nothing to do with their game. He told her there had been a man named Pharaoh, one of the men who had once worked for him, a man whose cruelty had crossed every boundary Salvatore could tolerate. Pharaoh had trampled on that sacred rule, had spread terror among small people, shop owners, honest working people who had nothing with which to defend themselves, and when Salvatore discovered what he had done, he had cast him out without mercy, stripped him of everything, and pushed him out of the world where he had once found shelter. He stopped for a moment, and then, in a voice heavy with grief, he went on to say that among the people Pharaoh had wounded, he had reason to believe there had been a kind bakery owner on the very street she had mentioned, in the very year she had spoken of. The room sank into a thick silence as soon as those words ended. Delphine sat motionless, her face slowly turning pale as the meaning of what she had just heard seeped into her mind. For one long, endless moment she could not speak, and the whole world around her seemed to spin, 20 years of silence suddenly breaking open. The man sitting before her, the man she had gradually come to care for, had begun to trust, had once stood at the summit of the very world that had taken her father from her. Tears spilled from the corners of her eyes, and her voice broke apart when she asked why he had to tell her this, why he could not simply let her go on living without knowing. She sprang to her feet, her whole body trembling with a storm of emotion she could not control, anger, pain, confusion, all of it rising together until it choked her. She demanded how he could sit there, so calm, and tell her that his world, his men, had turned her into an orphan, had put out the lights of the bakery and left that apron hanging on its peg forever. Salvatore did not avoid her tear-filled gaze, did not try to excuse himself or soften his guilt. He only sat there, receiving the full force of her anger and pain as though receiving something he deserved to bear. And when he answered, his voice was low and full of remorse. He said he told her because she deserved to know, because all her life she had lived with an unanswered question, and a wound that had never been named, and he could not let her continue sitting across from him each day, without knowing the truth that stood between them. He said he did not expect her forgiveness, that he had no right to ask for it, and that he only wanted her to know the rule that had made him cast Pharaoh out years ago had been born from his own pain of loss. And though that could never bring her father back, he still wanted her to understand that even in that dark world, there had been lines he had chosen never to cross. Delphine stood there, tears rolling down her face, caught in a chaos of emotions she could not yet put in order, and the whole room seemed suspended inside the pain of a truth newly exposed, a truth that would forever change the way she looked not only at the man before her, but at her own life as well. In the days that followed that fateful afternoon, Delphine lived inside a conflict unlike anything she had ever known. She could have chosen to turn away, ask to be transferred, and never have to see that man again, and that was exactly what the wounded part of her cried out for. But something, perhaps the very brutal honesty he had chosen when he laid the truth bare, held her back. Because she understood that a truly heartless and cruel man would never have voluntarily confessed something that could destroy him in her eyes, and that paradox made it impossible for her to simply force him into the mold she had already built. And so she returned, not as a psychologist, but as a human being trying to understand. And during another conversation, she asked him the question that neither Warden Fontaine nor the entire prison of Ashcroft had been able to answer. The question of why a man who had everything in his hands, every form of power, and every path to avoid a sentence, would willingly step into this place and lose his freedom. Salvatore was silent for a very long time, and this time, perhaps because he had already exposed the darkest part of himself, he decided to tell her the rest of the truth, the part no one in the world had ever known. He told her about his late younger brother, the one he had not been able to protect, and he told her that brother had left behind a son, a young man now 22 years old, his only nephew, and the only blood relative he had left in this world. He said that, after his brother's death, he had poured everything that remained of his heart into protecting that nephew, determined not to let him be swallowed by the very world that had destroyed his father. But that underground world had its own cruel pull, and the young man, in the recklessness and disorientation of youth, had slowly been drawn in, becoming involved in one branch of business within the network Salvatore was trying to dismantle. Then that fateful day came, when investigators tightened the net and prepared a major indictment aimed at the entire organization, an indictment based on laws concerning organized criminal activity, the kind of indictment that could put a man behind bars for almost the rest of his life. And among the evidence they had gathered, there were things pointing directly at his nephew. Salvatore understood that if he did nothing, that young man, the one who carried the blood of the brother he had sworn to protect, would lose all of his youth in prison, would be branded forever as a criminal, and the vicious circle of darkness would swallow the last person he could still save. And so he did the only thing a man in his position could do. As the head of the organization, the person to whom all of its activities could theoretically be tied, he stepped forward and took all of it upon himself. He arranged for every piece of evidence, every charge, to be turned toward him, admitted his leadership role in everything listed in the indictment. By doing so, pulled his nephew out of the reach of justice, allowing the young man to be cleared, set free, and given a chance to leave that world behind and begin again with an honest life. The price of his nephew's freedom was his own freedom, and he paid that price without hesitation, willingly walking through Ashcroft's gates and letting them lock behind him. When Salvatore finished, the room sank into a different kind of stillness. No longer the stillness of pain as it had been before, but the stillness of someone who had just seen the entire image she once believed in, turned completely upside down. Delphine sat motionless, and in her mind, the label of terrifying Mafia boss that she had placed on this man from the first day began to fall apart, revealing beneath it something she had never expected, the image of an uncle who had quietly sacrificed everything he had, including his freedom and the rest of his life, to save the nephew who was the last remaining blood of the brother he had failed to protect. She looked at him, and for the first time she understood that the man sitting before her was not running from his past or merely paying a debt to the law, but carrying on his shoulders a silent and noble sacrifice so great that her heart, hardened by so many years, trembled with an emotion she could not hold back. The rumor that had once slipped through the cell rows finally became real on a gray morning, when the new transfer group arrived at Ashcroft, and among the men who passed through the gate was one whose gait alone was enough to make all of Block D grow heavy. Oz Vance was large and brooding, with a cold calm even more frightening than savagery. The kind of calm belonging to a man who had caused so much pain that nothing seemed capable of moving him anymore. He came here with no connection to what was happening in Block D. He was simply another link in the machinery that moved prisoners from one facility to another. But fate, with its cruel irony, arranged for him to cross paths with Salvatore in those first days, and the moment he realized who that quiet man was, something dark flared in his eyes. Because Oz Vance had once been a subordinate of Pharaoh, the man Salvatore had cast out without mercy years ago, and for all these years he had nursed a smoldering hatred for the man who had destroyed his boss, who had stripped Pharaoh of everything he once had. Now, when the enemy he had thought he would never be able to touch was right there before him, behind the same prison walls, Oz Vance understood that the chance for revenge he had never dared dream of had come looking for him on its own. He did not rush. He was the kind of predator who knew how to be patient, and he began by watching, studying, following each thread of connection around Salvatore in order to find his weakness. Before long, he realized that this man, unlike the image he had carried of a solitary and cold Mafia boss, had things he cherished, people he cared about, and to someone like Oz Vance, those were the very cracks into which he could drive a blade. He quickly found a way to join forces with the remnants of Corrigan's men, those who still carried resentment after Salvatore had humiliated them in the machine shop, and that dark alliance took shape upon a shared goal, to bring down the man who had overturned the entire old order of Block D. Meanwhile, in another corner of the prison, Ezra Pike, Salvatore's timid cellmate, had accidentally become a link in the forming plot without even knowing it. Weak-willed and easily overpowered, Ezra had been cornered and threatened by Oz Vance and his men, and in his fear, he had blurted out things that should never have been spoken, about how much Salvatore cared for the young man named Milo, about the special connection between him and the female psychologist who met with him so often. He had spoken only in panic, only hoping to escape the threat in front of him, without realizing that those very words had given Oz Vance exactly the weapon he was looking for. But the instant those words left his mouth, But Ezra was swallowed by gnawing remorse. He thought of the man who had protected him from the first night he set foot in this dark place, the only person during all his time at Ashcroft who had treated him with kindness without asking anything in return, and he realized he had just betrayed that very man. That remorse tormented him through both day and night until he could no longer bear it. Despite the fear that had sunk deep into his blood, despite knowing exactly what Oz Vance would do if he found out, Ezra went to Salvatore and confessed everything. His voice trembled, his eyes filled with tears, and he told him how he had been forced, what he had said, and begged forgiveness from the man he had unwittingly pushed into danger. Salvatore listened in silence, and instead of the anger Ezra had prepared himself to receive, he only placed a hand on the man's shoulder and said he did not blame him, that fear could make people do things they did not want to do, and that his courage in coming back to confess showed he was far braver than he believed himself to be. But beneath that calm, reassuring manner, Salvatore's heart had grown heavy, because now he understood that the storm he had long sensed was finally here, and this time it was not aimed at him, but at the very people he treasured most, Milo and Delphine, the two people he was willing to do anything to protect. The storm came down on Ashcroft in the late afternoon, bringing sheets of pouring rain that lashed against the barred windows and thunder that rolled through every concrete corridor. Right at shift change, as the inmates were being counted and moved between the workshop and the cell block, a bolt of lightning struck one of the prison's power lines, and in an instant the entire area sank into darkness. The emergency lights took a while to come on, and even when they did, they only cast a flickering blood-red glow, leaving countless hidden corners swallowed by shadow along the corridor leading out from the machine shop. The immediate chaos of the power failure threw the count into disorder. Guards rushed back and forth trying to control the situation, and in that confusion a deadly opening appeared, exactly the kind Oz Vance had been patiently waiting for. He had calculated everything, and now, amid the flickering darkness and uproar, he and the remnants of Corrigan's men quietly closed in on the target he had chosen for the first blow. Not Salvatore, but Milo, because he understood that the cruelest way to destroy a person was to strike what that person cherished. Milo, while moving with the flow of men through the dark corridor, suddenly found himself separated from the crowd and pushed into a hidden corner. And when he looked up and saw Oz Vance's cold face appear in the flicker of red light, he understood that he was in real danger. He tried to back away, but there was no way out, and fear left him frozen. But at that very moment, just as Oz Vance surged forward, another figure rushed in between them, blocking the space between Milo and the danger. It was Salvatore, warned by Ezra, and with the sharp instinct of a man far too familiar with how darkness moved. He had followed the trail and arrived in time at the final second. He did not hesitate, did not calculate the cost to himself. He simply placed himself between his spiritual nephew and the man who wanted to harm him. The confrontation unfolded in the flickering darkness of the corridor, amid the howl of rain outside and the crash of thunder overhead. Oz Vance was unlike the men Salvatore had faced before. He was fast, ruthless, and utterly without fear, pouring years of hatred into every strike. Salvatore fought back with all his skill and composure, but he was no longer young, and he was fighting not to win or dominate, but only to protect, to keep Milo safe at any cost. He pushed the young man behind him and used his own body as a shield, taking the vicious blows that had been meant for Milo. And when Oz Vance swung a decisive strike with the improvised weapon he had hidden in advance, Salvatore did not dodge. He chose to receive it so it could not reach the young man standing behind him. At that moment, Delphine, who had stayed late to put the therapy room in order and had been trapped by the power outage, had just reached the end of the corridor with several guards, and she witnessed that entire moment in the dim red light, saw the man she had gradually come to understand, gradually come to care for, put his own life forward to shield another human being without a second thought. She saw him stagger, saw him still trying to stay on his feet to keep Milo behind him, and a cry tore from her throat before she even recognized it as her own. In that moment, every last prejudice remaining in her heart vanished completely, because what she was seeing was not a mafia boss, not a man belonging to the world that had taken her father from her, but a human being, willingly sacrificing himself to protect the weak, a noble and unconditional act she had never thought she would witness in a place as dark as this. The guards immediately rushed in, restraining Oz Vance and his men amid the chaos, flashlights sweeping wildly across the corridor as orders rang out. But Delphine could no longer hear anything. She only ran toward Salvatore as he slowly sank to his knees. And when she caught him, kneeling beside him on the cold corridor floor, she understood that this man, the man who had carried a lifetime of guilt and atonement on his shoulders, had once again chosen to sacrifice himself, not to repay any debt, but simply because this was the person he had finally become. In the flickering blood-red glow of the emergency lights, time seemed to stop around the two people kneeling on the cold corridor floor. Salvatore was wounded, but when the medical staff hurried to examine him, they realized that although the injury was serious, it was not severe enough to take his life, because even in the moment he took the vicious blow, a lifetime of instinct and experience had helped him shift just enough to lessen part of its deadly force. Oz Vance and his men had been subdued by the guards and dragged away amid the chaos, and orders were still echoing through the corridor, but to Delphine, all those sounds seemed to have become nothing more than a distant noise. She knelt beside Salvatore, her trembling hand supporting him, and when their eyes met in that dim light, something inside her, something she had kept locked away for 20 long years, finally broke open. Tears rolled down her face, and those tears were no longer the tears of anger or pain from that day in the therapy room, but tears of release, of something heavy finally being set down. She looked at the man lying there, the man she had once sworn she would hate because he belonged to the world that had destroyed her childhood, and she realized that she could no longer hate him, because the person who had just used his own body to shield the weak, the person who had willingly given up his freedom to save his nephew, the person who had bravely laid bare the most painful truth, even knowing it would destroy his image in her eyes, could not possibly be the embodiment of evil she had carried in her heart for so long. She bent down and in a choked, broken voice, she told him that she forgave him, not only him, but also the world that had taken her father from her, forgiving so that at last, she herself could be freed from the burden she had carried for almost her entire life. She said she had spent 20 years running from that pain, and now, because of him, she finally understood that the only way a wound could truly heal was not to avoid it, but to dare look straight at it and learn how to let go. Salvatore looked at her, those gray eyes now holding something almost like peace, and he said softly that he did not deserve her forgiveness, but he was more grateful for it than for anything in this world, because through all the years he had spent trying to atone, this was the first time he felt that perhaps, only perhaps, some part of him had finally been saved. During the days Salvatore lay recovering in the prison infirmary, something unexpected came. He was told he had a visitor, and when he looked up, he saw his nephew standing there, the young man for whom he had sacrificed everything, now more grown and more steady than the image preserved in his memory. The young man stood silently beside the hospital bed, and in his eyes was an entire sea of emotions held back, gratitude, remorse, and a deep love for the uncle who had traded his whole life for him. He told Salvatore that he had learned the entire truth, that he knew Salvatore had borne this sentence in his place, and that he could not allow that sacrifice to become meaningless. He said he had firmly left behind the underground world that had nearly swallowed him, that he was trying to build an honest life again, and that he had begun thinking about using the life ahead of him to help people who had lost their way as he once had, to turn their family's pain and atonement into something better. Salvatore listened, and for the first time in so many years, tears rolled down the face of that man who had always been so calm, because in his nephew's words, he saw the thing he had longed for more than anything. He saw that his sacrifice had not been useless, that from darkness and loss, something good had finally begun to grow. Delphine stood quietly at the doorway, witnessing that reunion, and she understood that she was seeing the rare miracle of redemption, the moment when a long chain of pain and sin was finally softened by love and forgiveness. And inside her heart, a peace she had searched for all her life finally began to glow. During the weeks, as Salvatore slowly recovered, something inside Delphine also began to move, a movement she had avoided for 20 long years. She realized that if she truly wanted to find the peace she had only just touched, she could no longer keep turning her back on her own past. All her life, she had refused to look at the file that recorded what had happened to her father, had pushed it away, as if pushing away something that might burn her to ashes if she touched it. But now, after everything she had gone through, she understood that the time had come for her to face it, and she did not want to do it alone. So on a quiet afternoon, she brought the old file she had requested and had managed to obtain, sat beside Salvatore in the infirmary visiting room, and told him she needed to read it, and that she wanted him beside her while she did. Salvatore understood the meaning of that request, understood how deep an act of trust it was from the woman who had once had every reason to hate him, and he only nodded softly, placing his hand over her trembling one as a silent support. She opened the file, and one page at a time, she read again the story she had spent her whole life running from, the story of her gentle father, of the fateful night that had changed everything. Her tears fell onto the papers, but this time they no longer carried the bitterness of a wound left abandoned, only the tenderness of a pain finally acknowledged and held. Then, when she turned to the final pages, to the documents recording the time after she became an orphan, her eyes stopped on a detail she had never paid attention to all these years. It was a note about the mysterious tuition aid that had come to her at the darkest moment of her life, the nameless, faceless money that had opened the door to college for her, had given her the chance to rise from the ashes and become the person she was today. For all those years, she had seen it as a chance blessing, an anonymous kindness from fate whose source she had never tried to trace. But now, as she sat beside Salvatore and followed the clues in the file, a strange truth began to reveal itself, and when she looked up at him, she saw on his face an expression she had never seen before, a confusion mixed with emotion that he could not hide in time. He confessed in a quiet voice that after casting Pharaoh out and learning about the innocent people who had suffered, he had quietly tried to make amends to them in the most silent ways he could, not to restore what had been lost, because he knew that was impossible, but only to ease even a small part of the suffering his world had caused. He had quietly provided for the families who had been affected, had silently opened doors for children who had lost their support, all of it anonymous, never leaving a trace, because he had not done it to be thanked, but only so that his conscience might find a little rest. And the tuition money that had saved Delphine's life years ago, it turned out, had been one of those silent acts of atonement. The man who belonged to the world that had taken her father from her was also the man who had quietly reached out to lift her up when she had fallen, though neither of them had known it until this very moment. Delphine sat motionless, her whole body trembling beneath the weight of the truth that had just been laid bare, a truth unbearably cruel and unbearably gentle at once, and in that moment, she felt 20 years of resentment and pain inside her finally melt completely away. She took Salvatore's hand, and through her tears she smiled, the smile of someone who had just found the peace she had searched for all her life. She understood that life sometimes moved in ways so strange and mysterious they were almost impossible to believe, that the thread of fate had silently bound her and this man together long before they met at Ashcroft, and that perhaps her presence in his life, just as his presence in hers, was not an accident, but a gift of healing that both of these wounded souls had been waiting for far too long. Salvatore Bianchi chose to stay and serve the whole of his sentence, even though with the connections and influence a man like him had once possessed, there surely would have been ways to shorten his time behind bars. But he did not look for those shortcuts, because to him, remaining at Ashcroft was no longer a punishment, but had become a mission. Day after day, he continued walking beside Delphine through the group therapy sessions, continued quietly planting inside men who had once lost their way the seeds of self-control and compassion, and little by little, the legacy of healing the two of them built together spread throughout Ashcroft, turning a place once filled with fear into a place where human beings began learning again how to respect one another. Milo, after serving his time, stepped out into the world with a steadier heart and a clear direction, carrying with him everything he had learned from the man who had saved his life. Then one afternoon, while helping Salvatore arrange the few personal belongings he owned, Delphine happened to find a stack of yellowed papers carefully kept as if they were something precious beyond measure. They were letters he had written over many years and had never sent. She asked his permission to read them, and when he gave a slight nod, she turned through the pages one by one. Most of them were letters he had written to his late younger brother, lines of aching confession about his remorse and his journey toward atonement. But one letter was different, a letter not addressed to any one person, but written to all the innocent people the world he had once ruled had wounded, people whose faces and names he did not even know, people who had suffered simply because they stood in the path of power and greed. In that letter, he wrote of the endless sorrow that haunted him when he thought of homes that had been broken, children who had lost their parents, lives that had turned toward darkness because of the decisions he and men like him had made. He apologized to them, one by one, though he knew that apology would never reach their ears, and he wrote that if there was one thing he prayed for, it was that even one of those people might someday find peace and a better life, in spite of everything that had been taken from them. Delphine read those lines, and tears silently rolled down her face, because though he had not known it, though he could never have imagined it, she understood that her father was one of the people to whom he was apologizing, and that she herself, the little daughter of the bakery owner from all those years ago, was the one who had found the peace he had prayed for, right beside the very man who had written those words. That afternoon, before leaving, Delphine did something she had never done before. She made 2 cups of hot coffee and brought one to set before Salvatore. The image of a hot cup of coffee, the thing that had once been used as a tool to humiliate and degrade a person on that fateful morning in the cafeteria, now became a gesture of sharing, of respect, and of healing. 2 people who had once stood on opposite shores of the same pain now sat beside each other in silence, each lifting a warm cup of coffee, and in that simple moment was contained everything that their long journey filled with tears had brought them to: forgiveness, understanding, and the faith that even the most wounded hearts could find their way back to the light. The story of Salvatore Bianchi and Delphine Marchetti leaves us with a profound lesson, that no matter how dark the past may be, it is not what defines a person forever, that anyone can choose to change and atone if they are brave enough to face themselves, and that forgiveness, though it may be the hardest thing in the world, is also the greatest gift we can give to another person and to ourselves. It reminds us that behind every human being, no matter what label they carry, there is a story, and that compassion and respect for human dignity have the power to heal wounds that once seemed impossible to mend. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so we can listen together to many more meaningful and compelling stories every day. We would love to know how you feel about this story, so please leave a comment sharing the feelings from deep within your heart, because every message from you is precious encouragement for us. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very last moment, and may everyone watching this video always have good health, a joyful life, peace, and a heart filled with happiness every day. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next videos.